How's it going, folks? Welcome back to Mythbuster Mondays. Every Monday for the foreseeable future, I'm going to be busting some myths for you and showing you why that thing that you hear spoken about may not be true or may not be as important as we're told it is. Here we're going to be discussing working at high sample rates and whether it's worth it or whether it could actually be detrimental to your audio. This is just my take on it, but I want to hear yours. So before you watch this, leave me a comment letting me know how you feel about it. Then when you're done watching the video, maybe comment on that comment and see if your opinion has changed or if my reasoning makes sense. Let's go. There's an ongoing debate amongst audio engineers over which sample rate we should be recording at. Is 44.1 good enough, or do we need to record at 96 or even 192 in order to get the best possible quality? Well, in short, I don't know, but I want to put some facts across that may help you make up your mind. Before I go any further, I want to give a massive shout out to Noam over at Safari Pedals for his insight on the matter. He's a font of all knowledge where digital audio is concerned and helped me see things from the different side of the argument. Cheers, Noam. I'm going to get into more detail in a moment, but first off, I just want to play you an example of some audio. And this is more or less guaranteed to be the first argument musicians make. Not necessarily strict audio engineers, but musicians, music producers. They'll often say that when you time stretch your audio, if you've recorded at a high sample rate, you'll get better quality. I'll play you the example now, and then we'll look at the logic behind it. Let me know if you think the version recorded at a higher sample rate sounded better when stretched. I'm kind of on the fence about it. In short though, the sample rate is the amount of digital samples your computer or digital recording device takes per second of the original inputted analog signal. So that 44.1 number means 44.1 thousand digital snapshots of the original signal are recorded per second. Going on purely that information alone, it would make sense that recording more snapshots per second would result in higher quality or a truer representation of the signal, because more data equals better quality, right? It's certainly true for video, for example. If you have something moving at 10 frames per second, it looks laggy, but 24 or 25 is close enough for the eye to register it as video as opposed to a load of images stitched together. Video is actually a nice example to use because when you're working with audio for video, you'll typically be working at a sample rate of 48 kilohertz, which plays nicely with video, whereas 44.1 is acceptable for purely audio. In this video, we're looking at things subjectively, but the one objective thing to say is that when you're dealing with anything that's going to be placed over video, 48 kilohertz is definitely the way to go. Anything outside of that is a bit more subjective, as we're about to discuss. The Nyquist Theorem states that in order to reproduce a frequency, we must have a sampling frequency of at least twice the frequency we're capturing. I'm not going to get too deep into that right now, other than to say, well, just that. If we want to reproduce a frequency, our sample rate has to be at least twice that frequency. So we can hear, in theory, up to around 20 kilohertz. So a sample rate of 44.1 kilohertz, as you're probably used to using, is more than adequate to capture everything we can actually hear. Or is it? Now, I understand the futility of playing back a high sample rate audio file on YouTube and asking you to tell me if there's a difference, because it's already been downsampled by the time you hear it and any benefit is kind of neutralized. So I'm not going to ask you to do an A versus B test because it's pretty redundant. But after this video, type into the search bar something like audio sample rate test or high versus low audio sample rate and read the comments. People are getting quite passionate about the beautiful high frequency extension on the 96K version that they've just listened to through their phone speaker on a YouTube video streaming at M4A audio or whatever they're doing now. It tops out about 16K. It's brilliant. That aside, one benefit you'll get of using high sample rates is less latency, but only if your computer can actually handle it. Currently my DAW is set to a sample rate of 44.1 kilohertz with a buffer size of 128 samples. You can see that the round trip latency is 12.2 milliseconds. When I double the sample rate to 88.2 kHz, that round trip latency is now 9.2 milliseconds. The reason for this is probably pretty obvious. If you're taking more samples per second, then each of those samples is now shorter. Shorter samples means less time taken to capture the same amount of samples. 64 samples at half the length results in a shorter time than 64 at a longer length. This is all well and good, but if your computer can't handle it, it's kind of redundant. So you're going to be raising the buffer size to counteract any of those problems, and you're going to be wiping out any significant improvement. So in theory, higher sample rates do give you less latency when recording, but only if your computer is fast enough for the task, and only if you're not using any plugins on the session when recording, which is a whole other thing. One main argument for using high sample rates is future-proofing and archival. So take this for example. You've been contacted by a label to archive some original multi-track tapes for a new release. You have the tools at your disposal, and you can either record at 48K or 192K. And this is going to be used as a master. Now, in my mind, it doesn't make a lot of sense to capture 48 when you can just as easily capture 192, because aside from file size, there's really no downside to capturing something at a high sample rate. The only thing that's going to suffer is your computer. It might have trouble playing back the audio in a large session that was all recorded at crazy high sample rates. But other than that, there's no downside? Well, almost. You see, there comes a point when raising the sample rate doesn't actually do any good, and in reality it's maybe creating more problems. Recording at 192 doesn't actually have any real effect on the audible range between 20 and 20k. It's only the really super high frequencies that it's going to make a difference upon. If you have instruments that extend up there, then potentially, yeah, it could be useful, but 96k is more than sufficient. In any case, your AD converter is going to be applying a low pass to the signal to get rid of that super high frequency stuff anyway, to prevent aliasing. That SM7B that you use to record the vocals at very high sample rates can't actually capture anything up there of significance anyway, so it's a bit of a moot point. When we're looking at it from the point of view of working within a DAW, this is a two-tiered problem. One is to do with converter accuracy, and the other is plugin accuracy. This is where the quality of an analog to digital converter comes into play. And also that funny thing you've maybe read about in manuals called jitter. Well, we're going to get into the proper nerdy world of digital audio here, so we're dealing with things that are kind of theoretical, and 99% of people don't actually know or care about this stuff, but it exists and can cause issues. In a great deal of consumer interfaces these days, the AD converter uses the same or remarkably similar chips. It's a tried and tested design that works well for what it needs to do. That's why many consumer grades interfaces can't go higher than 96k or sometimes 48k, because that jump up is of significant expense. The components surrounding that chip may change from one interface to another and will play a part in the sound, but understand that with many consumer level interfaces, the only thing that's really changing is the features you have available to you. So those audio interfaces will, for the most part, sound pretty similar. No massive leaps in audio quality just because you paid £50 more for it than the other one you were considering. You also need to consider the actual connectivity in your studio. Working at high sample rates may seem like a great thing to be able to do, but will in many cases half the amount of channels you can use. I know that some of the ADAT connected equipment that I have in my studio, I can send 8 channels back and forth at 44.1 or 48k. As soon as I go above this, it halves to 4 channels. This is to do with the data stream and how quickly a connection can actually transmit data. You may be reaching the upper limits of what your connection type is actually capable of. This in itself is an interesting point to touch upon, because you may be surprised by just how much your standard USB 2.0 connection can cope with. The way we work out how much bandwidth is needed for any kind of connection is to multiply the number of channels by the sample rate and then multiply that by the bit depth. So let's say you're recording 16 channels, multiply that by 44,100, and again multiply by 24 for the bit depth. You come up with the number 16,934,400. So that's easy to round up to 17 million. Well, a standard USB 2 connection can cope with 480 megabits per second, and we're only asking it to do 17. Even if we're working at 96k, then we're only using up 37 megabits per second. Make that 64 channels running at 192k and a bit depth of 32, you're only at 393 megabits per second. That doesn't top out the USB 2 bandwidth limit. All right, it's kind of crazy, but in real terms, it might do, because it's not quite as black and white as that, and there are some other variables to consider. Regardless, it's not about the computer connectivity, it's about the way you're connecting gear through stuff like MADI and ADAT, because these connections are a lot slower. MADI, for example, has a fixed data rate of 125 megabits per second, so couldn't do that crazy 192 example. Every cog needs to be turning together in a setup with high sample rates. Just because your computer can handle it, just because your USB bandwidth can handle it, doesn't mean that every link in the chain can handle it. And you may end up spending more money just to get to the point where you can increase your sample rate. And for what reason? All these factors combined are going to put some pretty intense pressure on all points in the chain, and that's where stuff starts going wrong, like introducing things like jitter. So what is jitter and why does it matter? Well, an extremely basic way of explaining jitter, because I'm quite basic, would be to say that it's the unwanted variation in clock synchronization. It's about the inaccuracies of the converter and how close or far away the samples are from where they should be. Long story short, if you're recording at 96K with a low quality audio interface that's designed to really sit on a desk and record at 44.1, the chances of jitter are far greater for two reasons. Firstly, it's not designed to be 100% accurate at 96K. There's an allowable tolerance there, but also there are over twice as many samples for jitter to have an effect on. Higher sample rates means there's more opportunities for failure, and there are more samples taken, so more samples that could be misplaced. With higher quality interfaces and standalone AD-DA converters, like the big buck stuff, the tolerances are far tighter, but you're less likely to get that jitter. But still, the fact remains that if you're recording at high sample rates, there are more samples for jitter to have an effect on. Is it audible and does it matter? Well, that's not for me to say. That's for the audio interface and AD converter companies to convince you of in their marketing blurbs. But no matter how small the difference is, there is a difference there. The way that plugins deal with audio comes into play here as well in a couple of ways. So firstly, 192 kilohertz, which I'm kind of using as an umbrella term for high sample rates, I guess. 192K and above, or somewhere around that, aren't necessarily as thoroughly tested by plugin companies. So think about it. We're making a plugin. It sounds great at 44.1, 48K, stellar. 96 is cool. We implemented that little thing that stops aliasing. More on that in a moment. But oh my God, 192 doesn't work properly. There's too many high frequencies in there. This plugin wasn't meant to deal with frequencies above 80K, but we've just tested it on that soft synth that has that seemingly never-ending high end, and it's making the plugin go crazy. Are we really going to delay the plugin release, costing significant amounts of money just to cater for the 3% of users who operate at 192, of which only 1% are actually using that specific soft synth? Well, of course we're not. It's good enough to get out there. There lies the problem that companies have to deal with every single day about whether an issue is big enough for them not to meet the deadline. You see this in every industry in the world. But as soon as you try and use that plugin at a sample rate of 192, you're in uncharted territory, and there may be issues that the manufacturer hasn't dealt with, because why would they? You may find that massive companies are testing their plugins at every sample rate imaginable, but are they really putting as much time into making sure they work at DSD level sample rates as they were at 44.1 and 48? No, they're not. There's no point. You reach the point of diminishing returns, and pretty quickly the boss upstairs is telling you to stop delaying stuff and just get that plugin out there. As oversampling is a fairly common feature in many modern plugins that need it, it's worth covering as well. Well, which plugins need it? I'm glad you asked. Really anything that creates harmonic distortion, or any other types of distortion that create harmonics. That sounds twisted, but there's a difference between harmonic distortion, a process that adds harmonics to the sound, which can result in a distortion-like sound, think of tape saturation, and then processes that clip the signal, and a byproduct of that is that harmonics are created. Anything that extends the frequency range is going to make use of oversampling, as aliasing is going to be less of an issue. Think distortion plugins, saturation plugins, even compressors that are analog emulations, and of course EQs that push stuff up into that 20K and above airband. Aliasing happens when frequencies above the sample rate of the material you're working on can't be reproduced, so they essentially mirror back onto the audible spectrum. Have a look and listen to this example. This is a sine sweep with various types of distortion added, displayed on an EQ with a visualizer. You'll notice that when high frequencies are concerned, the wave on the display doesn't just go up, it comes back again, because these frequencies are being folded back and mirrored. But when oversampling is applied, it doesn't have quite the same effect. Hey guys, future Sam, I guess, here. So I'm editing this video right now, and everything sounds fine when it comes out of Logic, when I'm doing this oversampling stuff, and you can see the difference, blah, blah. But as soon as I import the audio that I've exported out of Logic into Premiere, no matter what sample rate I do it as, no matter what settings I have, what plugins I have instantiated or not, it sounds like garbage and there's aliasing. So there's something in Premiere's audio engine that is stopping this from actually being demonstrated properly. And I hate that. That's really annoying. So long story short, if you're doing anything serious with audio, don't do it in Premiere because it's apparently garbage. Or it may be that I've just not found the right setting for it. But it does sound really weird. There's like an echo on it and it's bizarre. Actually, listen to it here. Doesn't sound the way it should, does it? It's got like that whoop, 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 which is kind of an effective aliasing, but kind of not as well. Anyway, long story short, I'm not going to play you it because that would be counterproductive. So I'm just going to show you it, and you can just see the way that the wave goes up and then comes down again. Sorry about that. Blame Adobe. Hang on, Sam. You said a minute ago that plugins sometimes aren't designed to work at high sample rates, and now you're showing the benefits of oversampling, which is essentially just making a plugin work at a higher sample rate. Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Oversampling as a feature that can be turned on or off is kind of different to having the plugin operate continuously at a super high sample rate. But just know that if high frequencies are an issue, oversampling can save you in some cases. But maybe you like it without, I don't know. In Isotope Trash, there's a preset that's centered around that aliasing sound, and I think it sounds pretty cool. So there we go, a deep dive into sample rates and whether or not high sample rates are better. Basically, well, it kind of depends, doesn't it? High sample rates will technically capture more of the original signal, but it's not necessarily a good thing and can lead to further issues down the line, not least of all with your equipment. Working at 44.1 is enough to capture all the frequencies that our ear can reliably hear. So does that mean it's good enough for everything? Maybe. Maybe not for video. All I can say is that I've never once in my life listened to a track and thought, oh, I'm so glad they recorded this at 192. I can instantly tell the difference. But maybe you have. And if you have, I want to know about it. So drop me something down in the comments. And either way, thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon. Take care.